Good afternoon and welcome to our third session of Uncovering Hawkeye History. I am your host, David McCartney, and I serve as the University Archivist at the University of Iowa Department of Special Collections and Archives, located in the main library on the University of Iowa campus. I started in this job back in January of 2001, which means I've been helping with chronicling the university's history and materials for more than 20 years now. Those of you who read the Iowa Magazine might recognize me by my Ogle column. Usually appears in the back section of the magazine, where I've been able to share some of the remarkable elements of our collections with readers for the past 12 years or so. Since 1847, the University of Iowa has broken barriers and blazed new trails as a beacon for learning, creativity, and collaboration. Today's event is part of the university's celebration of our 175-year history, and I'm honored to be your host of this four-part series. Yes, you hear two dogs barking in the background, and I'll hope that they'll be calming down in a couple of minutes once that squirrel passes by. Well, we've identified a mix of faculty, staff, and alumni to be featured throughout the series, with each session highlighting areas of distinction for the university, both during different points of its history, as well as opportunities for future growth. Each session has live closed captioning and will be recorded and shared on our YouTube channel at a future date. We invite you to join us for that. We encourage you to share the session with Iowa friends and family who might not be able to join us today. Well, last week we heard from three Iowa alumni: Samantha Chang, who received her MFA here at Iowa in 1993. She is the director of the Iowa Writers Workshop and leads the nation's top creative writing program. We also heard from Quinn Early, who earned his Bachelor of Arts degree here in 1987, Hawkeye football star and screenwriter, and who recently has been delving into the history of Hawkeye athletics for a recent film. And Patricia Winokur, who received her degrees in 1988 and 1991, professor of internal medicine, infectious diseases, and executive dean of the Carver College of Medicine. Dean Winokur spoke about the intersection of teaching and medicine at the University of Iowa hospitals and clinics. If you missed last week's session, we did record it, and we hope to add it to our YouTube channel later this month. So on to today. Today's session is on endless innovation, an R1 research institution, somewhat focusing on the university's history in the latter part of the 20th century, more specifically 1948 to 1997. From using robots to assist with inner ear surgery, to breaking the frontiers of space exploration, to reimagining law and society, and everything between, the University of Iowa has been spearheading innovative ways to approach all aspects of our society. And we are joined today by three remarkable alumni guests whom I'll introduce to you throughout the program. You may submit your questions at any time for any of our panelists during this program, and you can do so by using the Q&A functionality. Now, we are covering a lot of ground today, so we'll try to get as many questions in as time will allow. To get us started, I would like to begin with a quotation that I've been invoking for the last two sessions, as well as today. This is, I think, a quotation that helps to set the tone for our session again today. And this is from the first report of the faculty to the Board of Trustees. This was submitted by the faculty of the fledgling State University of Iowa on July 6, 1858. This was about 3 years after the first classes were held on campus. And the report suggests much optimism at that time, despite the fact that the university was a new institution and, quite frankly, a very under-resourced institution at that point. But the statement reads as follows: "We regard it as no small honor to have been the first laborers, the first working faculty organized in an institution which we believe is destined, at no distant day, to take a high and noble stand among similar institutions in our land." That's from the very first report of faculty to the Board of Trustees, now, of course, the State Board of Regents in 1858. It calls to mind today's topic concerning research innovations in the latter part of the 20th century. I think it's safe to say that perhaps, well, not perhaps, certainly one of the most remarkable achievements in the latter part of the 20th century, the entire century for that matter, is Apollo 11, the lunar landing. And that mission would not have been possible without the research of Dr. James Van Allen here at the University of Iowa. Dr. Van Allen, a few years before, had confirmed the presence of magnetic fields, the Van Allen belts, encircling the Earth. And for a long time, I wondered, well, really, it's a remarkable discovery, but what's the significance of that? What does that knowledge add to our understanding of space exploration? And I came to learn a bit more about this, and I did write a column about this in 2019 on the 50-year anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing. Back in 1969, I was 13 years old. I was very excited about the Apollo 11 adventure, and I even had a tape recorder set up next to our television set so that I could record the news coverage of the lunar landing at that time. And I have to say that while I was thrilled, I didn't really sense the same degree of relief that perhaps the NASA scientists had, because at a young age, I didn't really appreciate the possibility of real danger that the astronauts faced at that time. The danger was revealed with the discovery of the magnetic belts, the Van Allen belts, when that data had been gathered by the unmanned Explorer 1 mission in 1958, which confirmed the presence of these radiation belts. Now, this matters for missions that are controlled by humans, because the radiation very well could pose a danger to any spacecraft that are intended to penetrate those radiation belts. Physicists had expressed concern that there could be a barrier to manned and unmanned space exploration unless there were proper precautions taken in matter of in the form of protective shielding for the spacecraft and of course protective suits for the astronauts. And so in order to keep the radiation exposure to a minimum, any spacecraft traveling through the Van Allen belts would have to attain a certain velocity. So imagine, if you will, jumping through a fiery hoop. Not that I would recommend that, and I certainly won't do that myself, but I think that's perhaps the closest analogy we can think of. Now, within the scientific community, there was, to be sure, a great deal of disagreement over whether NASA should even devote resources to manned space flights for that very reason. Many, I think, who were opposed or at least skeptical of manned missions included Dr. Van Allen. In terms of how data could be gathered, it was his position that in general, the data gathering could be done more efficiently with unmanned missions. But nonetheless, the knowledge or the understanding of the presence of radiation belts made it possible for NASA to construct spacecraft and other protective shields in order to maintain the integrity and the safety of those on the Apollo 11 and subsequent missions. So without a doubt, research conducted here at the University of Iowa made possible one of the greatest accomplishments in the scientific world of the 20th century. It is not an exaggeration by any stretch. My friends know that I'm no mathematician, but in principle, I understand now the significance of that type of discovery and the fact that Dr. Van Allen's research made possible one of science's greatest accomplishments. With that, we will pursue the theme of research at an R1 institution. And it's my pleasure now to introduce to you our first guest today. Kevin Washburn is the N. William Hines Dean and Professor of Law in the University of Iowa College of Law. Dean Washburn joined Iowa Law in 2018 after previously serving as the Dean of the University of New Mexico School of Law and as the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs at the U.S. Department of Interior. His specialty subjects include the law of gaming and gambling and federal Indian laws. Dean Washburn, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me. So the period after World War II was a chaotic time for the law school. So we're looking at the period in the latter half or so of the 20th century. And that was a busy time. Law school alum Virgil Hancher was the university president at that time. And our most locally famous law student, Niall Kinnick, he had left school to join the war effort, and he did not make it back. Our former dean, Wiley Rutledge, was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court during World War II and was serving at that time until 1949. The law school's enrollment had dwindled dramatically during World War II because a lot of our students, like Niall Kinnick, went off to serve the war effort. And so we dwindled down to 23 students by 1943, and many others went as well, and not just Niall Kinnick, but other students and some faculty as well left the law school to go serve in that effort. But soon the law school had to figure out how to serve the returning GIs. By 1947, enrollment, which had gone down to 23 students, was up to 500 students. And it was really challenging for the law school to pivot that quickly. By 1950 or so, enrollment stabilized at about 400 students, and it's gone up and down a little since then, but today we have around 500 students. The only innovation there is that today some of those students are international and they come from places as far away as Asia and Africa. One of the most important innovations in our existence as a law school came in 1952. The Iowa Law School Foundation was established by the class of 1952 with an initial assets of $1,000. That was 2 years prior to the creation of the UI Foundation. But for many years now, there have been very good cooperative relationships between the Iowa Law School Foundation and the UI Foundation, now called the UI Center for Advancement, but it was the law school that invented that idea here in Iowa. In recent decades, one of the most important tasks that the University of Iowa Center for Advancement has continued to serve for the Law School Foundation has to run its development program and to manage all of its investments. By 1976, that original $1,000 investment by the class of 1952 was up to, with other gifts, to $1 million. And between new gifts and investment growth, that fund, which began at $1,000 in 1952, surpassed $100 million in total assets this past year for the first time in our history. And given the gradual decline in state support for higher education, this resource has proved very significant for us and has substantially mitigated the fall in state support for legal education. And since 1952, the primary purpose of most of those resources is supporting scholarships for students. And it's one of the reasons that today Iowa Law is considered a top value law school, one of the top 10 in the country. The average debt of our grads is among the lowest in the US. For the class of 2020, the class of 2021, the average law school student loan debt was about $85,000. And that may sound like a lot to many of you, but that's among the very lowest debt load figures of any of the 100 law schools in the United States. And the class that joined us last fall is our strongest class in school history based on both LSAT score and undergrad GPA. And part of what attracts these outstanding students to the law school is the tremendous value we offer and the scholarships we have. So that original beginning in 1952 with the creation of the Iowa Law School Foundation with $1,000 has turned out to be exceedingly meaningful for us. Perhaps the next most notable date in the law school's history in this period is 1954. That's the date that Willard L. Boyd joined the College of Law as a professor. Known to all of us as Sandy, Professor Boyd served as a professor for about 10 years before becoming a university vice president and then president of the university in 1969, where he served until 1981. President Boyd, I think as everyone knows, was a consequential president who served at a complicated time in our history. Soon after Sandy Boyd went over to main campus from the law school, the whole university and the whole country was living in the rough and sometimes unruly social change of the civil rights era. Sandy was the longest serving president since law grad and lawyer Virgil Hancher. And after 12 years, a 12-year term as university president, Sandy went on to serve 15 years as the president of the Field Museum over in Chicago before returning to the law faculty in 1996. It's impossible to talk about a community without highlighting some of the people in that community who've made a difference. And Sandy Boyd here in the Boyd Law Building is one that made a huge difference for us. Another one of those is Professor Arthur Bonfield, a Yale Law School graduate who joined the College of Law as a still fairly young man in 1962, hired by the dean at the time, Mason Ladd. Bonfield believed strongly in research and scholarship and the role of law in society. He also had an abiding passion for law reform and public service. Professor Bonfield channeled his immense intellect into teaching and law reform work right here in Iowa. Professor Bonfield spent a lot of time traveling back and forth from Iowa City to Des Moines along I-80 back and forth. As a professor, he set about drafting numerous laws for the Iowa legislature, including important civil rights laws for the state in 1965, 1967, and again in 1978. He also helped to modernize state government. He brought order to the chaos of state administrative agency proceedings by drafting an Administrative Procedures Act and then an open meetings law and eventually major amendments to the Public Records Law. So a lot of the reason government is so transparent in Iowa is through the work of Arthur Bonfield working with the legislature throughout the second half of the 20th century. Though through Bonfield, who was on the faculty more than 50 years, and several other professors who had similar passions in law reform, the law school in Iowa City has had a major role to play in Des Moines in shaping state government, increasing transparency, and modernizing the way state agencies work in Iowa. Professor Bonfield continues to shape things here at the College of Law. He's known as being very outspoken, and he was from the very beginning. If you read the history of the law school, that's the way he would describe in his first year of teaching. From the moment I arrived, he frequently stopped by my office to give me advice. Wearing his iconic bow tie, Professor Bonfield never expresses any thought without strong conviction, even if you're only talking about the weather. On one occasion early on, I said, "Arthur, why are you shouting at me?" He came in my office and I said, "Why are you shouting at me?" He said, and his voice rose as he was saying it, "I'm not shouting. This is my normal indoor voice. I'm from Brooklyn." He was a beloved at teaching, and he's still around. He still comes by now and then. I was in Burlington 2 weeks ago, and I sat down with some of the judges down there, the state district court judges in the courthouse down there. One of them, who graduated in the 1970s, singled out Bonfield as one of his favorite professors, and he said, "I could listen to that guy talk all day long." And indeed, he's contributed. A lot of our alums feel that way. Arthur Bonfield is also legendary at the College of Law for building our law library into the second largest law school collection in the United States, second only to Harvard, and one of the best staffs of any law libraries anywhere. And that continues to this day. Bonfield recognized that law libraries are to lawyers what laboratories are to scientists, and he worked hard to feed that library well and make it a truly outstanding laboratory for the research that he and his colleagues did and that is still being done here today. Indeed, one of the themes through our law school's history that has been important is that the law school is centered around excellent research and strong writing. The Iowa Law Review, edited by students, was founded by 1915, but by the 1970s, it had become and remains today one of the strongest student-edited law journals in the country. In recent years, it has been ranked consistently as a top journal for scholarly impact, ranking as high as number 11 or number 12 in the country. And that's in no small measure due to the strength of our world-class library that Arthur Bonfield helped to establish. During the last quarter of the 20th century, though, this focus on research, including student-led research, increased dramatically, spurred on by the law school's strong library. The Iowa Law Review has been our flagship journal, but in 1975, the law school's second student-edited journal was founded, the Journal of Corporation Law, started by Father David Bain, a Catholic priest who served on our faculty. Today, the Journal of Corporation Law is the second highest ranked journal in the country in the specialty of corporate law. And you should know there are about 15 law schools in New York, but we here in Iowa, in the cornfields in Iowa, we have the second highest ranked journal in corporate law in the country, second only to a journal at Yale. The Journal of Corporation Law has helped us develop a strong relationship with the Delaware Chancery Court, which is the site of registration of many of the major US corporations in the US. And one of the little known facts is that we send a lot of students out to clerk for judges in Delaware because of the strength of our program here. And some of them stay in Wilmington or migrate to New York, but we have a lot of students on the East Coast in part because of that strength. In 1989, Professor Burns Weston founded our International and Comparative Law program, and with a student, David Alberts, and others, founded a third student-edited journal, the Journal of Transnational Law and Contemporary Problems. I have had a chance to get to know David Alberts well. He's now a very successful lawyer in Manhattan for a major law firm, and he's been leading our effort to create an endowment for the Journal of Transnational Law and Contemporary Problems and having great success. We very much appreciate that. Around that same time, Dean Bill Hines also opened our Writing Center, providing feedback instruction to students on legal writing, and we've continued that strong program. It continues to this day. In 1996, the Journal of Gender, Race, and Justice was founded, the fourth student-edited law journal at the college. Though only 25 years old, the Journal of Gender, Race, and Justice is currently ranked in the top 10 of student-edited journals focused on racial and social justice in the United States. In sum, the latter half of the 20th century was key in helping us establish the foundations of our reputation as the writing law school. During this period, we grew from 1 to 4 widely known law journals and built the best public law school library in the United States. So many of the seeds of our current successes were established during that time in the latter half of the 20th century. I mentioned some of our international work when I mentioned the founding of the Transnational Law and Contemporary Problems Journal, but our international work is broader. In 1984, we created the London Law Consortium, created by Iowa and 7 other law schools originally, but it has been carried forth just by Iowa, although some other students do send their students from time to time. But over time, that program grew to be the largest European study abroad program of any law school in the United States, with 60 to 80 students attending that program just before we went into the pandemic. And we've had to put it on suspension for the last couple of years, but that's another great development of ours. In 1976, Bill Hines became the dean, leading this law school for nearly the next 3 decades until 2004, and becoming one of the longest serving law school deans of any law school in the modern era. Most of the major milestones that I mentioned were the result in part of his good vision and management. And Dean Hines was a contemporary of Arthur Bonfield. They started here on about the same day in 1962. And Bill Hines just finished teaching in his 60th year, though he is semi-retired and teaches only 1 class per year these days. Because writing has been such an important part of our history, and because former President Sandy Boyd has also been such an important champion of writing at the university in this law school, let me end with a short bit of prose from Sandy Boyd. 40 years ago, in a commencement address, he said, "Fortunately, we live in an imperfect world because we can improve it. Fortunately, we live in a diverse world because we can learn from it. Fortunately, we live in a changing world because we can grow in it. I hope that you will all agree with me that Sandy's wisdom is timeless, and these words are as meaningful today as they were in 1982. They continue to reflect our highest values. Thank you for allowing me to tell you a little bit about the history of the University of Iowa College of Law. David, let me turn it back to you.
Thank you, Dean Washburn, and please stay on if you could. We do have a couple of questions for you, and I might add the quotation from Sandy Boyd is absolutely, it's pure Sandy Boyd. I am so glad that you shared that. Thank you. I do have a couple of questions from our participants. One concerns the relationship between the College of Law and the Iowa legislature. You shared how some of your faculty during the mid-20th century were instrumental in helping to develop Iowa's statutes. How is Iowa law involved with the Iowa legislature today?
Thank you, David. It's a good question. We remain fairly involved, maybe not as much as in our peak, but we remain available to the legislature, and we actually have a project going between our law library and the state law library. And if you haven't been over to the Capitol building, if you go in there, go to the library. I think it's the most beautiful space in the Capitol, and that makes me smile to know that the most beautiful space in the state Capitol building is a library. We still work with them. We have several alums, probably around 10 alums that serve in our legislature, and we don't always see eye to eye with them on everything they do, but we continue to be a resource to them and try to be a resource for good. It's a good relationship.
Okay, thank you. Another question, and this, of course, is apropos to Iowa as the writing university, and you were making some extensive references to our law journals that are produced here at Iowa. They do seem to be, those journals seem to be very well regarded. Participant wants to know, how are law journals ranked? What are the criteria used in ranking the merit of a particular journal?
It's a good question. There are several different rankings of law journals, but one of the most important ranking is scholarly impact. How many times are those journals and their articles they publish cited by scholars or by judges in their work? And the rankings that I was speaking about were based on scholarly impact. So what that means is articles in those journals were cited by authors in other law journals around the country, and our journals fare very well in that ranking. They have significant scholarly impact, and also by courts. You will be surprised where you see these journals cited. You'll be reading a Supreme Court opinion or a famous law review article, and you'll see references to articles cited in our journals. So that's the scholarly impact is basically the bottom line, and they have a great scholarly impact.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Another question concerning the makeup of the student body in the College of Law, specifically with regard to scholarships. Do you know off the top, and this might be a statistical type question to refer back to, but if you happen to know at least roughly, what is the percentage of law students who are currently receiving scholarships, either full or partially funded?
It varies a bit each year, but it's more than half of our students get a full or partial. If you can include all scholarships, it's more than half of our students, and that's an important resource. It helps us attract the best students, and we get great students. As I told you, the class that entered this past fall is the strongest class in our history, with the highest GPA from undergrad and the highest LSAT score median in history. So those scholarships help out a lot, and then they help in the back end with low debt load for these students. So it's more than half.
That's outstanding. Dean Washburn, thank you so much for joining us. Please stay with us. We'll be circling back to all of our panelists toward the end of our session today. Thank you so much for your remarks and for enlightening us about the College of Law. Our next guest is a four-time alumnus of the University of Iowa and professor of otolaryngology, Dr. Bruce Gantz. Dr. Gantz has an extensive career here at the University of Iowa, and through his extensive research and practice, he has helped Iowa become a leader in cochlear implants, and he was the first person to use a robot to assist in cochlear implant surgery. He joins us today to speak about his research. Dr. Gantz, welcome aboard.
Thank you, David. I'm going to share my screen here a minute and put it in presentation mode. And hopefully you can see that. Does everybody see that? All right. So I've been asked to talk about my personal experience at the University of Iowa, which actually covers 58 years, and in particular, the development of the Iowa Cochlear Implant Clinical Research Center, which I've had a large part of my career devoted to, and then talk about our experience with different milestones and the robot. So a cochlear implant is actually the first man-made device that interfaces with the central nervous system and actually can replace a damaged sense, the sense of hearing, which is extremely important. So this picture here on the right side will demonstrate a young woman with a cochlear implant that's actually implanted under the skin. And then there is a device on the outside that is a device that delivers the coded information from a speech processor that then delivers it to the inner ear, and that stimulates the inner ear, and then it travels up the brain and it is interpreted as language, which is really pretty phenomenal. So at Iowa, my experience started in 1964 as an undergraduate. I attended dental school for a short period of time and then went to medical school, did an internship at the University of Utah in general surgery, and then came back and did a residency in otolaryngology head and neck surgery at Iowa, and began my faculty position in 1980. During that time, I was able to spend a year at the University of Zurich, learning the specialty of neurootology and bringing back some new strategies to our department. My exposure with cochlear implants really began as a resident. Dr. Brian McCabe, who was our chairman at the time, thought that cochlear implants were something that we needed to bring to Iowa. And so as a resident, he sent me to Dr. William House at Los Angeles, who was the person that developed the first cochlear implant that was implanted in a human. And I spent a couple of weeks in Los Angeles learning about the implants. And then we came back and we performed the first cochlear implant surgery at the University of Iowa hospitals in 1980. Well, in 1981, I was fortunate to do this fellowship in Zurich. And when I got there, I learned that they were doing some innovative research in cochlear implants. The people there actually introduced me to several cochlear implant teams in Europe, and I was able to visit them in Paris, in London, in Bonn, Germany, and Vienna. And actually, when I was in Vienna, the people that actually have started one of the implant companies, there are 3 implant companies in the world, and MED-EL was started in Vienna. And I was able to bring 4 implants back in my suitcase, got permission from our human subjects board, and was able to implant those in patients at Iowa. This was long before the FDA got involved in the regulations that we now face today. So when I was back in Iowa, I realized that we were not going to build another implant, but we could be an independent center that would be able to evaluate the outcomes of cochlear implants, because these places around the world that were implanting these devices, were developing strategies to try and show that their implant was the best. And so there wasn't a uniform manner or strategy to implant or to develop the testing strategies, and that's what we did. So in 1983, we developed a large team. Involved surgeons, audiologists, psychoacoustics, electrophysiologists, and in the following years, we added musicologists, neurologists, radiologists, speech pathologists, and statisticians. So this little picture here in this slide shows what a cochlear implant actually does. We slide an electrode into the inner ear, and the inner ear's purpose is to take information from the outside in your environment and change it into an electrical signal through the hair cell system. And most people that go deaf or lose hearing are due to the loss of the hair cells. So we slide this implant into the inner ear, and then it electrically stimulates the nerves. The cochlea is tuned like a piano. Here in the base, you hear the high frequencies, and in the apex, the lows. So it's a bandpass filter, and it separates the information and sends it to the brain. So the original faculty were myself, Rich Tyler, Paul Abbas from speech and hearing, John Knutson from psychology, and George Woodworth from statistics. We were fortunate to develop a grant and a program project funding in 1985, and we have been successful for 7 go-rounds of 5-year grants, and we have generated over $60 million in NIH funds to support this research. We've also been able to acquire funding from industry at $1.7 million. Presently, our research is focused on expanding the indications. We are trying to improve the preservation of the residual function of the inner ear, which we'll talk about a little more. And we are also on the cutting edge of understanding how the central auditory system puts information together to make us understand and develop words, or lexical processing. So some of our accomplishments, early on in 1983, after I got back from Zurich, a woman came to my office and said, "Would you like to learn about the new multi-channel implant in Australia?" And I said, "Oh, sure." So I went to Australia and I worked with Graham Clark, who was the founder of the first multi-channel cochlear implant. We were able to bring that back to Iowa City. And in 1983, we placed the first multi-channel cochlear implant outside of Australia in Iowa City. We also, in 1987, we were able to implant a child that had never heard before. And this was not ever done in the past. We usually implanted children that had learned some language and had an auditory memory, and we thought we needed that auditory memory to enable the brain to understand this information. Fortunately, this young child from Rudd, Iowa came. We couldn't find a child that had meningitis because our medical system's quite good, and we didn't have many children that had deafness from meningitis in Iowa. So we took a chance. Our team evaluated this child, and we decided to implant that child. Fortunately, it's always better to be lucky than good. That child graduated from the University of Iowa with an engineering degree, played in the Iowa marching band, and is now he is employed by an oil company in Texas. We pioneered bilateral implants at the same procedure, and our team developed a neural integrity monitor so that the implant can actually tell you what's going on in the cochlea and actually in the auditory nerve and how it interacts with the brain. This neural integrity monitoring is now being used by all 3 major implant companies around the world that are incorporated in the implant. we developed the hybrid implant concept. This was, we knew that when we started evaluating our patients, we found that those with a little more residual hearing did a little bit better. And so we designed a device with the Cochlear Corporation, and we implanted our first patient in 1999. And fortunately, those patients did very well. This is the first time we were able to implant the inner ear with a device that was 6 millimeters in length and preserve the residual hearing. And that's really important because we found out that people could hear better in noise, much better than with hearing aids, if they had some residual hearing and the electrical processing from the cochlear implant. This enabled people to recognize melodies and appreciate music better, and actually able them to hear from side to side, or spatial hearing, being able to localize sound. When you put a cochlear implant in an ear, in one ear, and they have some residual hearing in the other, the two systems don't work very well, and you can't localize where sound is. If you preserve some low frequency hearing in both ears, you can localize sound, and that is a real advantage to people. Finally, the newest development is the development of the Iota Motion soft robot. And this was developed by people in our department, Dr. Marlon Hansen and Chris Kaufman, who was a resident, designed a device. It was funded by the NIH, and the company development was funded by the Small Business Association grant, administration grant. And this is designed to try to reduce the force in the inner ear as we implant the device. As you'll see in this next slide, that this is what the robot looks like. It is temporarily screwed to the skull and then removed after the implant is placed. The implant goes through this little clamshell, and then this motor actually moves it at a very, very slow rate. If you look down here in the lower right, you can see the implant going into the cochlea at about 1/10 of a millimeter per second. That is really slow. And the advantage here, in this top graph over here on the left, you'll see this is what happens in the inner ear when we're trying to implant that by hand. And this is what happens when you implant it with the motor. The forces are greatly reduced in the inner ear until you get to the end of the device. So this device is hopefully going to allow us to implant these devices with less trauma, preserve more residual hearing, and expand this procedure to many more people. Because people know that most individuals with hearing aids, after they buy them, they put them in drawers because they don't help them discriminate words, where the cochlear implant actually does. So finally, this is a slide that demonstrates or presents the people that we now have engaged in our research from the Department of Otolaryngology, Department of Communicative Sciences and Disorders in the Liberal Arts College, Department of Psychology from Liberal Arts, the College of Public Health, School of Music, Department of Radiology, Department of Psychiatry, Department of Neurosurgery. We have an international researcher with us, a neurologist from Newcastle, England, Shuman He from Ohio State, and Viral Tajani from Case Western Reserve. I think one of the real strengths of the University of Iowa is the ability to develop multidisciplinary research. I tell people that there are plenty of silos in Iowa, but none in the university. If you look outside, I tell people that are recruited to Iowa, you won't see any fences between the houses. That's what the university is all about. And I think this group of investigators demonstrates the camaraderie and the ability to bring different thought processes together to focus on a problem and solve problems. So thank you very much for allowing me to share some of my experience at the university. It's a fantastic place.
Dr. Gantz, thank you very much for your presentation and for really presenting such an informative inside view of remarkable research in the realm of hearing. It's just a remarkable uh, uh, journey, I think, that you and your colleagues have been on for quite some time. And I appreciate your especially noting the importance of collaboration. And I love the silos analogy, especially in the proper use of that term. I have a couple of questions here from our participants. I have one myself. You mentioned that the first child who, or first patient, I should say, who received this implant in 1987 was a child from Rudd in northern Iowa. And Rudd is a town not far from where I grew up in Charles City. And I do remember that story. Can you tell me again, how old was the child at the time, and what was his reaction when he heard for the first time?
Well, thank you, David. That child was, I think, 4.2 years of age. And so he really had no language, and we have videotape of him prior to his implant. I think when he first heard something, we also have a videotape of that. And I think he was a little startled. You know, the parents were crying. I mean, it was an emotional experience. I mean, all of these early days when we were putting in implants, it was really exciting, and we spent a lot of time and effort with this child. And we did not know if an individual that did not have an auditory memory, if this device would work. And like I said, we were very fortunate. And I remember going to a meeting in Europe and taking a video of this child when he was, after he had had the device for a couple of years and was starting to really speak. Some people in the audience were astounded and aghast that we would ever do something like this. But today, this is really the standard of care for deaf children that are born to hearing families, which is about 90% of children that are born deaf are born in hearing families.
Another question from one of our participants: could a cochlear implant be an option to restore hearing caused by a vestibular schwannoma? I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
That's correct. Well, probably not if we took the cochlear nerve when the schwannoma was removed. Now, there is a brainstem implant, and we have placed some brainstem implants here at Iowa. Unfortunately, the bandpass filtering isn't there. And so they've never been effective in actually allowing people to understand speech without improving on their lip reading. It's an aid to lip reading. It really doesn't provide the open set speech or the ability to talk on a telephone.
Thank you. What do you think or feel when you see someone hear for the first time because of your research?
Well, you know, we've been doing this for so long, and it's sort of every day, every time we go to the operating room, we are putting in 1 to 4 cochlear implants. Last year we did a couple hundred. This year we're probably going to do more. And I think many of the reasons why we have had this increase is the masks. People can't communicate with hearing aids when they have when people are masked. So I think you know, it's still extremely rewarding for us. It brings tears to people's eyes the first time they are turned on. Most of the time, when if they've had hearing and then lost it, and they've been struggling for long periods of time. You know, one of the things that why hearing is so important is that when you start to lose your hearing, you begin to have more social isolation, which in turn causes cognitive decline. And this is one of the things that we're studying, is how do we bring people back into communication with their peers, and so they are more whole. It's really an important thing for people that are losing their hearing, and we all are losing our hearing, to get it evaluated and make sure that you are still interactive with your peers.
You received 4 degrees at Iowa, and then you stayed at Iowa to pursue your career. Questioner wants to know, how did you decide to come to Iowa the first time? And that would be 1964.
Well, I was actually born in Brooklyn, and then my parents moved to Iowa when I was 5, and we
Excuse me, that's Brooklyn, New York, right? Not the town near Grinnell.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so I had cousins that went to school at Iowa. I never applied anyplace else. I just thought everybody went to Iowa.
We're glad you did. We're so glad you stayed. And Dr. Gantz, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. And please stay with us. We'll look forward perhaps to checking back in with you in a few minutes.
Thank you, David. Thanks for the invite.
Our next guest is Ed Wasserman, the Stewart Professor of Experimental Psychology. Dr. Wasserman's research interests include comparative analysis of learning, memory, and cognition. But what we're most interested in his sharing today will be some insights into many Iowa innovations and what might yet to come. Dr. Wasserman, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. You should be seeing the title page of the presentation, University of Iowa Past and Future Innovations. You also see 3 critical logos in the history of the University of Iowa. Upon its founding in 1847, the University of Iowa was entrusted by Iowa's first legislature to advance scholarly and creative endeavors through leading-edge research and artistic production. In those 175 years, our faculty, staff, and students have done just that. Let me share with you a few stories attesting to Iowa's innovative spirit, promoted and nurtured by its commitment to unfettered academic freedom. Let me also alert you to a new vista of innovation that lies ahead. You may not know this, but Iowa was the birthplace of the butterfly stroke. And you could see that very graphically displayed over our Olympic pool. You see it says, birthplace of the butterfly. You also see the names of Dave Armbruster and Jack Sieg. David Armbruster is shown on the left, his pupil, Jack Sieg, is on the right. David Armbruster was Iowa's first and longest serving swimming coach from 1916 to 1958. Jack Sieg was one of Iowa's standout swimmers from 1934 to 1937. It just so happens that Armbruster spotted Sieg playfully swimming underwater with amazing speed, using a dolphin-style kick while on his side. The pair creatively combined the butterfly arm stroke with a dolphin kick on the stomach as they experimented to improve the breaststroke, speeding it along. Armbruster and Sieg published the dramatic results of their research in 1935 and called the stroke the dolphin breaststroke. And you see here a couple pages from the actual article. You can see down here, Jack Sieg swimming, and here as well, different views of him using this arm stroke. You can't see the dolphin kick from this particular angle. Well, the story didn't end there. Sometimes stories are good and end right at that point, but this one took a while to develop. Olympic officials, in fact, refused to sanction the new stroke for 2 decades. Only in 1956 was the now renamed butterfly stroke officially added to the Olympic Games in Melbourne, Australia. Since then, many consider the butterfly stroke to be the most difficult and exciting of all competitive swimming strokes. Given its utterly unplanned origin and its long road to acceptance, it's clear that this innovation involved more than a stroke of good luck. And here's the bronze sculpture out front of the pool in the CRWC. It was done by Larry Nolan in 2010. If you happen to be in the building, you might take a look. It's quite lovely. Let's move now to medicine and the Ponseti method of correcting clubfoot. You here see an infant with one clubfoot and one normal foot. Clubfoot is a serious birth defect in which an otherwise normal and healthy infant's foot is twisted inward and downward. The cause of clubfoot is unknown. It may have a hereditary basis. It may be also the result of the mother's taking drugs or smoking or other issues. If left untreated, clubfoot doesn't spontaneously improve. Over the years, many different treatments, including surgery, had been tried, but they were generally unsuccessful. Against this backdrop of failure, a novel approach arose based on Ignacio Ponseti's suspicion that clubfoot is not a surgical problem. Here he is, Dr. Ponseti in 1943. Ponseti fled Spain in 1939 after completing his medical training due to the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, which took place the day after he finished his exam. While briefly living in Mexico, Ponseti met Dr. Juan Ferril, who himself happened to have club feet. Dr. Ferril spoke approvingly of Dr. Arthur Steindler, Ferril's mentor at UIHC. With a letter of recommendation from Ferril, but with little proficiency in English, Ponseti arrived in Iowa City in 1941. Here, he began his long career as a pioneering medical scientist and compassionate practitioner. One of the first projects that Steindler gave Ponseti was to follow up 24 patients who had received clubfoot surgeries in the 1920s. Ponseti reported to Steindler that these surgeries were rather unsuccessful. The patient's feet were misshapen, stiff, weak, and painful. Steindler believed that these poor outcomes might be overcome by improved surgical techniques, which he was willing to try. However, Ponseti was skeptical and explored a rather different approach. After many years of study and experimentation, Ponseti devised a non-surgical method involving progressive manipulation and casting. And here in the top row, you see a series of snapshots of the original clubfoot of the baby, but its gradual movement toward normality. And below, you can see the corresponding casts that were placed on the infant's foot. It's a dramatic improvement, as you can see, without surgery. Well, Ponseti's treatment was a stunning success, and he reported this success in a 1963 paper. However, the paper was largely ignored. Many years later, at the urging of his wife, Ponseti provided still more comprehensive documentation of the success of his technique in a volume published by Oxford University Press. It also had a little impact. But in 1998, the university put forward the virtual hospital, and a posting about the Ponseti method appeared on this website. That proved to be the game changer. Hospital referrals and professional recognition rapidly rose. And in 2006, the American Academy of Pediatrics endorsed the Ponseti method as the most successful, non-invasive, and cost-effective clubfoot treatment. Since then, another Spanish immigrant, Dr. Jose Morquende, is now building on Ponseti's legacy. And you see Morquende along with Ponseti and one of their small patients in that photograph. Following Ponsetti's death in 2009, Dr. Morquende became the director of the Ponsetti International Association. Well, what about literature? Well, most of you are familiar with the field of dreams and Bill Kinsella. Here he is in later years. Bill Kinsella was, at the time he wrote here at the University of Iowa, a 43-year-old Canadian graduate student in the writer's workshop. As a class project, he wrote a 20-page short story in 1978 entitled Shoeless Joe Comes to Iowa. It was a sports fantasy culminating in a baseball game played in an Iowa cornfield. Talk about unlikely storyline. The story was included in an anthology which happened to catch the eye of a literary agent. And the agent asked Kinsella, could he write an expanded story and turn it into a novel? And well, the answer was yes, he could, just like a baby in 9 months. Shoeless Joe was published in 1982, and it was a great success. Here's the cover. It was highly praised in the New York Times. It won 3 awards in Canada and led to a Houghton Mifflin Literary Fellowship. And it also sparked the interest of screenwriter-director Phil Alden Robinson. After many failed attempts, Robinson finally got the green light from 20th Century Fox to produce the movie. The film premiered in 1989 as Field of Dreams and starred Kevin Costner. It received acclaim as one of the best baseball films, fantasy films, and inspirational films on many lists. It also earned 3 Oscar nominations, not too shabby for a first-time project. But beyond that, the film site became a popular tourist attraction. Many of you may have visited the Field of Dreams. Nevertheless, there was one spectacular act to follow. In 2011, Denise Stillman and her associates planned to hold a major league game in a nearby field. Although she passed away, not in time to see it, 10 years later, an official major league game was in fact played on August 12th, 2021, right here in this new stadium adjacent to the Field of Dreams movie site. It involved the White Sox and the Yankees, and yes, the White Sox won. Just as Kinsella might have said, if you build it, they will come. And the fans did come, and it was a rip-roaring success. Well, there's something interesting about all these stories. They end beautifully, but there was no sightedness to that on the part of the innovators. All 3 of these endeavors yielded remarkable results: an exciting new Olympic swimming stroke, a highly effective non-surgical treatment of clubfoot, and a popular novel, an acclaimed film, and a major league game played in rural Iowa. But none of the innovators themselves could ever have seen what these results were going to produce. With no end in sight, you might ask, how could these creations have ever come about? Well, I've written a book, and in this book, I do my best to demystify the process of creativity and stress the parts that are played by 3 key factors: the context, the consequence, and the coincidence involved in these storylines. In short, creative behaviors and products don't arise by design. They arise as if by design. Well, let's talk about another lesser known story of innovation here on the University of Iowa campus. This involves the maturation of psychological science, and it entailed the collaboration of 2 very important campus figures. We're going to go first now here from philosophy to psychology: Gustav Bergman and Kenneth Spence. Bergman was born in Vienna, Austria, where he received his PhD, but he was forced to flee Nazi rule coming to Iowa in 1939. He had been a member of the Vienna Circle of mathematicians, philosophers, and scientists, having also worked with Albert Einstein. Spence was born in Chicago, Illinois, but spent most of his childhood and early adulthood in Montreal, Canada. There, he received his bachelor's and master's degrees at McGill University. He received his PhD from Yale University in 1933 and later spent 4 years at Yale's primate facility in Florida, coming to Iowa in 1938. Bergman's views on the philosophy of science helped place Spence's empirical contributions to the science of learning into a more robust theoretical perspective, the two publishing together here in 1944. That perspective also propelled work at the University of Iowa into the national limelight and expanded the department's studies into developmental, clinical, and educational psychology. In his 26 years at Iowa, Spence devised new ways to study learning, directed 72 PhD theses, and chaired psychology from 1942 to 1964. In 1968, Spence Laboratories of Psychology was built to honor Spence and to promote further excellence and innovation at the university. And there's a picture of the building. The number of faculty in that period since 1968 was greatly increased, as were the areas of expertise that it comprised. I came in 1972. Well, we're about to move from psychology to neuroscience. And in the process of doing so, we needed better and modern facilities. The Psychological and Brain Sciences building was finished just 2 years ago in 2020. And there you see it alongside the Spence Laboratories. It will now take the department into the developing realm of neuroscience with the study of learning and neuroplasticity as its organizing theme. To illustrate how that evolutionary transition might proceed, let me outline a recent study comparing human and avian learning. Professor John Freeman, graduate students Ellen O'Donoghue and Matt Brochard, and I gave university students and pigeons a novel task in which they had to sort different visual stimuli into two categories. The stimuli were circular grids containing lines of different widths, so-called spatial frequencies, and angles, orientation. So for example, there would be any number of stimuli. Here are two of them, which differ in their orientation and the number of lines that are represented, their frequency. Here's a fuller sampling of the entire space with which we worked. So you can see here that the orientation of this stimuli get more vertical to more horizontal as we move this way, and they involve increasing numbers of lines as we move this way. The space can be categorized or split in two different ways, either in terms of orientation, where you see the more horizontal lines in blue, or more vertical in the case of the orange, or it can be split the other way in terms of frequency, with fewer lines in orange, more lines in blue. And the task is quite simple. An individual, a pigeon or a person, sees one of those stimuli and simply chooses one of two responses to make. Arbitrarily, we could call them response 1 and response 2, and they go through a whole series of these and categorize the stimuli, receiving reward for being correct and not getting reward for being incorrect. Well, these two ways to categorize the stimuli allow subjects to attend to either the orientation or the frequency of the grid lines. But we wanted to prevent subjects from choosing either of these easy ways out. So we devised an innovative problem, what we called the concentric rings task, where subjects had to attend to both dimensions. This task should be especially difficult. Indeed, it might even be too difficult for bird brains to learn. So here were the original stimuli that we worked with. And here were the categories that we created. Now one category of stimuli came from the blue region, and another category of stimuli came from the orange region. Now you can't split the space one way or the other. You've got to use information involved in both the orientation and the frequency of the lines. How did they do? How did the pigeons and the people do? Well, they both did pretty well. Yeah, I know on the left, it looks like the pigeons are learning a little bit faster, but that's just because we accumulated their data over more sessions. But overall, you can see the trends look quite similar. Both different kinds of organism learn just fine. And in fact, you might be inclined to suggest, well, they probably learned the same way. But they didn't. They use quite different rules to learn this task. And what's going on in these graphs is this is the percentage of the or proportion of the subjects in that happen to be pigeons using guessing at the beginning, that's the dark blue. And then as training goes on, the green moves into place, and that's using the optimal rule to perform the task. People don't seem to be guessing as much at the beginning. They seem to be using one of these two different properties of the stimuli, either the frequency of lines or the orientation of the lines, and then move into using the rule. So the pigeons adopt a pure guessing strategy to begin with and then move directly to the correct rule. People entertain strategies using one dimension or the other selectively. Well, how are we going to explain a dramatic difference like this? Well, let's start with the brains of people and pigeons. Our next horizon is indeed going to be to explore the brain structure and function of these two different kinds of organisms. So pigeons, well, yeah, they have brains. They work pretty well for pigeons, but they're really differently organized. You can tell by where the colors are on this particular graph. And not surprisingly, pigeons have many fewer brain cells, and they're much lighter. After all, heavy heads can't fly. People, on the other hand, have much larger brains, heavier, and involve more cells. So given these striking disparities in neuroanatomy, discovering just how these strategic disparities in learning come about isn't going to be a quick or easy task. But that's precisely why the neuroscience of learning offers such enormous challenges and opportunities. Perhaps for the university's 200th birthday, we'll have the answer. Thank you.
Dr. Wasserman, thank you very much. This is fascinating, and I am really excited to read your book now. I will share with everybody the title. It is As If by Design, How Creative Behaviors Really Evolve, published 2021 by Cambridge University Press. And it sounds fascinating. Thank you very much, Dr. Wasserman. We do have a couple of questions from our participants, and the first one is one that I think gets to the heart of what we think of in terms of spontaneity in research, if there is such a thing. And of course, that's a large part of what you discussed. And that is that the word innovation is a buzzword very often in business and in higher education. How do we encourage innovation if so much innovation is coincidental?
Edison said, if you want to have a good idea, have a lot of them. The fact of the matter is that it's a winnowing process. We like to conceive of these people who produce great products like Steve Jobs and Albert Einstein with great ideas as being geniuses, and assume that these ideas somehow pop fully formed in their heads or right on the drawing board from the start. But it turns out to be a much more laborious trial and error process. To encourage innovation is probably to allow for failure. to favor failure. And although we have publish or perish, a university is a perfect environment in which it's possible to explore avenues, to challenge ideas. Look at Ponseti. He decided he wasn't going to follow Steindler's lead and just try yet another surgery. He moved off in a very different direction. Part of the reason why he might have done so is while he was treating combatants in France during the Spanish Civil War, he learned the merits of casting. Casting was actually used instead of antiseptic. If you got a cast on and you were very careful to do so, wounds healed much faster this way. So he became very proficient with casting, and you might suggest perhaps he just transferred what he had learned about casting, also dealing with fractures, to conceiving of this as a possible stratagem for dealing with clubfoot.
It almost seems counterintuitive to think of encouraging innovation when, as you said, it happens perhaps as a byproduct of an observation or a need is recognized in some way that had not been anticipated before. Would that be fair to say?
Sure, there are all kinds of serendipitous discoveries. The book talks about several of them. The high five was something that happened on the spur of the moment. Dusty Baker and Glenn Burke had hit back-to-back home runs, and they exchanged high fives. Nobody had seen anybody do this before, and this coincidence caught on. The Dodgers used it as in their promotional materials. They had a song about the high five, and you can see then the consequences of some spontaneous event can mushroom. And look, everyone in the world knows what the high five is now, but they never planned that it be this universal expression of joy to be celebrated and shared with someone else. So sometimes innovations are spur of the moment. Sometimes in the case of Edison, it was the case that, point of fact, he used over 1,000 different filaments to try to get a long-lasting light bulb. He said, try and try again, right? The process is one where failure can actually bring about ultimate success, but patience and persistence are important in the process as well.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Dr. Wasserman. I'd like to invite all three of our panelists back onto the fold now. Dean Washburn and Dr. Gantz, would love to have you both back on. We have a question for all three of you, and you can fight over who gets to answer it first. Dr. Gantz mentioned that there are no silos at Iowa, that is at the University of Iowa. How do you approach a new research project and engage a cross-campus partner, somebody who is perhaps outside your discipline or in another unit or department? And any of you can take that first.
Well, I guess we started that because of the need to assess the full patient and how the patient interacts with his environment or her environment and society. And, our small department just didn't have the expertise. We needed people that were electrophysiologists that knew how to measure the activity that is going on in the inner ear, or EEG activity within the brain, to help us measure and record. And fortunately, being a student here and understanding the university, I had some friends in speech and hearing, took some courses in Wendell Johnson as an undergraduate, and got my interest piqued about cleft palate and hearing, and was able to interact with people in that department, and that continued to expand when we needed people to understand we needed people to help us with music. We went to Kate Gefeller in the School of Music, and she was interested in the psychology of music. Much of otolaryngology and hearing testing came from psychology in the early days with the psychologists that were here at Iowa, and so we had friends in psychology and asked them to get involved, and they got very excited about what we were doing. So I found it very easy to integrate, interact, and share our patients with them. They got very excited, and it stimulated a lot of cross thought processing and made us so much better. I mean, we are still the only NIH-supported cochlear implant clinical research center in the country. And it's all from the strong multidisciplinary interaction that goes on at Iowa. And I'm sure that my other two colleagues could mention similar kinds of things with law and medicine and engineering and psychology, and it's so much fun here.
I would add to that. It does take some effort because it doesn't happen magically. It takes reaching out to people. But here at Iowa, if you reach out to someone, they will reach back. And that's what really works. We have a lot of, at the law school, we have people that we work with in the College of Public Health and in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and Tippy College of Business, and really all over. And some of them we give courtesy appointments to, not for them to teach here, but just so that they can share in research. And we invite them over when our faculty are presenting papers. So, and we invite them to come present a paper if they've got something that they think would be useful for the faculty, or they could use feedback from a law faculty. So we try a lot of different ways. We are in different specialties, and so that sort of leads potentially towards silo effect, but we really try to keep it to a minimum. And like I said, people reach back when we reach out, and that's what's great about being in a great university town and bumping into people at the Hy-Vee and all that. It's a nice place.
Students can also be catalysts. That is, their master's or dissertation projects can bring together people from multiple disciplines. I've worked with, because of this, students from pharmacology, anatomy, neuroscience, philosophy. All these things do emerge, and because of its academic moorings, it's not like a business situation. There's more freedom of movement from discipline to discipline, and that's one of the things that makes being at a university so much fun.
You know, our department had a history of a multidisciplinary team that was developed after World War II with Cleft Palate and Dwayne Spreetzersbach, who was a provost at the university eventually, helped develop that team at Iowa, involved people in our department, people in speech and hearing, to help improve the quality of life of individuals. And so it was something that has been here for a long time.
I might add, thank you all for your response to that. I might add, just from my own experience in reading up on the history of the College of Liberal Arts here at Iowa, in 1947, there was a program implemented, interdisciplinary program, which was quite innovative in its time. Literature, science, and the arts. As an undergraduate student, you could earn a Bachelor of Arts or a Bachelor of Science degree in LSA. It was an interdisciplinary program, no longer functioning, but in its original form, but today, in many other ways, it continues to function as a means for students to participate in an interdisciplinary environment. So it's fascinating to hear from the three of you affirm that in your own respective positions. I have a couple more questions here. This is for both Dr. Gantz and Dr. Wasserman. How is AI, artificial intelligence, or machine learning affecting your research?
Well, I will tell you that that is just entering into our research with cochlear implants, because we think that we can do remote programming of these devices with machine learning and AI. And I think this is just at the very beginning, but I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity for us to expand what we do and evaluate our patients, not necessarily on site. We have developed strategies that we have apps for telephones that we can ping the patient and ask them how they're interacting in their environment in real world time, and measure the ambient noise through the phone, and then help them set their devices. So I think this is a new area and an exciting area for us.
When we have compared people and pigeons on this task, this specific task, and found these differences, we have another entity that we plan to compare their performance with, and that is a mathematical model, an artificial intelligence. And we suspect that it's going to more closely approximate the pigeon than the person in terms of the nature of the learning mechanism involved. But one can create different AIs that involve different assumptions. Remember, one assumption of people is that they strategically go after one of the two dimensions, whereas pigeons just take all the stimuli in one after the other and learn individual responses to each individual stimulus, which is probably the closest thing that AI does right now. It's the massive computational capacity of AI that enables artificial systems to recognize individuals in crowds. It's not because they're so smart, it's because they have remarkable capacity to store and retrieve information. You might not think that the pigeon's capacities are so dramatically great, but they might be sufficient to do the job along the same lines that today's computer would.
And David, if you don't think those issues come up in law, they do. So imagine the person who's driving a self-driving car, whose self-driving car crashes into someone else's self-driving car. Whose insurer is responsible? So we even have those issues in law.
That is an excellent point, Dean Washburn. Thank you, the three of you, for your responses to that, because this is a new frontier that we're all concerned with, and indeed it does affect many aspects of our lives potentially. We have time for two more questions, and this next one is directed to you, Dean Washburn. We had a question about Iowa Law's continuing legal education program, and we know this work is usually done in coordination with the Iowa State Bar Association. Are there emerging needs or specific topics that have been requested in that realm that you might be willing to share?
Well, we are always, yes, there are. And we have a faculty that does this nationally. And I will tell you, so just for example, with the new presidential administration, there's new approaches to mergers of big companies and antitrust guidelines. And so we had a professor realized this was a need, and so quickly developed a CLE, a continuing legal education program, on the new merger guidelines at the Department of Justice, and presented those last year. We try to keep our ear to the ground and try to remain very relevant, and that's just one example. But the world is always changing, and the world of law is always changing. We just hired someone who's an expert in tech and privacy and artificial intelligence, who's going to join us next fall, because we're trying to keep up with those issues as well. So stay tuned.
Those topics are all interrelated, aren't they? Thank you, Dean Washburn. I have a final question for each of you, and you may each have up to a minute to respond, because we are getting close to 6 o'clock Central Time now. Dr. Wasserman ended his presentation mentioning that we might solve some of today's research questions by Iowa's 200th anniversary. What are you each excited for in the future of Iowa, in the realm of research or whatever realm?
Well, in our own department, we've tried to map out a future. We've tried to devote resources and develop a theme of neuroplasticity and learning, because so much of the developing technology of brain science relates to how we come to respond adaptively to changing environments. Let's face it, climate change poses behavioral problems to all the species that inhabit Earth. We're concerned with some of them, but imagine that, for instance, you were used to a certain pattern of foraging to find food or to find shelter, and all of a sudden those places they were gone. The resources were to be found elsewhere or not at all. How does an organism then come to adapt to these changes? So those behavioral changes have to be mediated by changes in the nervous system. And there are many neurodegenerative diseases that might be importantly informed by the basic science of learning. In much the same way that Bruce has had a team working to deal with one kind of problem, there are other problems that well, futurists have imagined being able to insert healthy tissue in place of damaged tissue in the brain in order to see to what extent recovery of function is modifiable in this fashion. So the basic science of learning and understanding the mechanisms of neuroplasticity have important practical and clinical implications, to be sure.
Well, I will just expand on that because the neuroplasticity is what we are focusing on in our patients with hearing loss. We know that genetics plays an important part. I think that we are going to be altering genetic structure in the next 50 years or even in the next 25 years. And that may help us fight some of the diseases and disorders that are at this point we have no treatment for. And I think our team is looking to try to figure out how we can expand this technology that we think is so important, has been so useful, to more patients and more safely. And so that the cognitive decline that is associated with hearing loss, and the Lancet report says that hearing loss is the most modifiable human issue that may contribute to changing cognitive decline, that we might have an impact. And so we really think that the research that we're doing, we are trying to understand how the brain recognizes that information. We know that when we preserve some residual hearing, we can re-establish some of the normal patterns of recognition, of auditory recognition, and how rapidly the brain recognizes that. Then there's less confusion, and so the patient can respond more appropriately and more fluidly. And I think in the next 25 years, we hope that these kinds of strategies will be able to be applied to many, many more people in a very safe manner. And maybe we will impact some cognitive decline. It's not all of the answer, but it's some of the answer.
So at the College of Law, I think one of the things that we are excited about is working with our students to help improve public policy in the United States and move us forward. Right now, there's a vast divergence of views and viewpoints between people, and lawyers naturally deal with disputes, and that's the space they live in. A lot of lawyers are dealing with that every day. And I've told our students that it may be their responsibility and their unique ability to bring our country back together and reduce some of that divergence and help solve all these significant problems that our country faces. at a time of disagreement, we have to come together on some things. And so we've been encouraging our students. I think 50 years from now, the question will be whether we were successful in helping our students to help solve the world's problems, because people do look to lawyers for leadership in some of those public policy disputes. And that's what we're aiming to do here. And I think we will be successful. We are unique. We're a unique community in Iowa around some of those issues, but I think it may be people in Iowa that need to lead the rest of the country back to where the whole country needs to be.
In Washburn, thank you very much, and a very appropriate way to close out our program today. Thank you all. Let me first thank our three featured guests for this afternoon. I learned a lot, and I'm sure that you did too. It's a remarkable assembly of people with us. Let me thank also our guests who joined us today. All of you made this possible, and we wouldn't have been here without your support. I'd like to extend thanks to Heather Walensky, Nikki Bontrager, Tony Hicks, Derek Harrigan, and Ben Hill for their technical and editorial support in producing today's podcast. Our recording will be uploaded to the University of Iowa Center for Advancement's YouTube page in the weeks to follow, in case you'd like to share it with your friends. Be sure to be aware of that, and we'll be looking forward to having that available soon. If you enjoyed tonight's session, you can register to join us next week too, as we talk about the university's most recent history with some of our longest standing administrators. We will be joined by Rod Lennertz, Iowa alumnus, campus architect, and Senior Vice President for Finance and Operations at the University of Iowa. Rod joined the UI staff in 1994, and he has lived much of the history that he'll be discussing with us next week. Also joining us will be Lynette Marshall, the President and CEO of the University of Iowa Center for Advancement. Lynette joined the UI Foundation staff in 2006, and she has led the university's fundraising efforts ever since. And we'll also be joined by Peter Mathis, who is a two-time Iowa alumnus, and he serves as the Vice President for External Relations and as Senior Advisor to the President at the University of Iowa. Those of you who have registered to attend will receive some advance readings from our speakers this coming Friday, and you are welcome certainly to send your questions that you may have in advance to Heather Walensky, our producer. On behalf of all of us, thank you very much for your support of the University of Iowa. And as we always say, once a Hawkeye, always a Hawkeye. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.